So if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly: sexual promiscuity, impurity, lust, evil, desire, and greed, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming on those who are disobedient. These are the ways you also once followed when you were living that life. But now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have stripped off the old self with its practices and have clothed yourselves with the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its creator. In that renewal, there is no longer Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ is all and in all. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Much has been written about the simmering anger in our nation. Currently, there is widespread rancor and mean-spirited rhetoric that separates and divides. A number of polarities have taken root: whites and minorities, rich and poor, Americans and foreigners. In a recent columnist David Brooks writes that he never understood how fascism could really get a foothold in Europe until recently. What it takes, he says, is for people to begin to lose their self-worth and to base it on their tribe rather than on their personal behavior. They become mired in resentments, spiraling down deeper into their addictions and a feeling of victimhood. They fall for politicians who lie about the source of their problems and about how they will overcome them. Facts lose all meaning. In some ways, it's very odd that we have so much anger in our nation today. The unemployment rate is below 5%. Violent crime has dropped from its peak in 1991 to half of what it used to be. Property crimes down by 43%. 9 years ago, we had 170,000 troops fighting and dying in Iraq. Today, fewer than 5,000. There's far less homophobia today than at any time in our nation's past. Yet, many are still contrary, callous, and combative. Some seek to crucify anyone who disagrees with them. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have surprised everyone in this year's presidential race. How did they do it? They channeled the anger of many Americans. Now, we know that when we commit to becoming followers of Jesus, we pledge to live in ways that are just and loving. We're not always successful, but we strive to be compassionate and to treat others the way we want to be treated. When we fail, we do not simply brush it off. We do not start coming up with a bunch of excuses. We confess our mistakes. We ask forgiveness. And then we recommit to living as God expects us to live. Writing to the Colossians, Paul says that we must change not only our behavior, but other things as well. In verse 5, he mentions damaging behavior, sexual promiscuity, impurity, lust, evil desire, greed. Then in verse 8, he hones in on one specific matter that is tearing the Colossae church to shreds. He highlights anger and those attitudes and actions that orbit around it. Malice, slander, abusive language, lying. Who among us does not know what it is to be wounded by a loved one and then lash back? Rather than taking the vulnerable step of forgiving the other person and working to cleanse the relationship, we seek revenge. We try to inflict pain that is equal to or greater than the sting we felt. Now, Paul is savvy enough to know that all of us have a dark side. We do not always choose what is positive and life-enhancing. Sometimes we cling to what is venomous and destructive. We can be compassionate, but we can also be mean-spirited. We can be trustworthy, but we can be dishonest. We can be generous, but we can also be greedy. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, "If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were only necessary to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But in fact, the line dividing between good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." Knowing that each of us occasionally embraces darkness rather than light, Paul writes, "So if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above." Now, what do you think Paul is talking about when he says, "if you have been raised with Christ"? He's alluding to baptism. See, for Paul, when we are baptized and become followers of Jesus, we die to our old self and we are resurrected to a new being. Paul continues, "Set your minds on things that are above, not the things that are on earth." Now, he's not encouraging us to quit focusing on the afterlife so much. He's not saying that we should pay little attention to this life. Rather, he's calling for a paradigm shift. He's calling for a change in our basic assumptions. He's asking us to change from one way of thinking to another way of thinking so that we can be transformed from one way of being to a new way of being. Once we've been baptized as a follower of Jesus, we're to become new people who are not guided by the values of our culture, but rather by the wisdom and teachings of Jesus. We're to love others, to forgive, to serve, to be generous, to reconcile broken relationships, to strive for peace. Paul knows we can choose darkness or we can choose light. He urges us to set our sights high and to be wary of the values that emanate from our culture, or to follow impulses that emerge from our passions. Anger can distort our thinking and take an emotional and physical toll on us. Paul calls on us to set our sights high, to set them on Christ, who reveals to us the things that produce healing and wholeness and hope. Now, we have to admit that some forms of anger are justified. Righteous anger. Anger at injustice. Anger at evil. Anger at cruelty. I'm angry about terrorism and gun violence and racism and xenophobia. However, I must not forget that anger is such an intense emotion that it's potentially lethal. That even my righteous anger can turn divisive and destructive. It always needs to be channeled toward a constructive goal. Now, it's difficult for me to imagine someone volunteering for a suicide mission until I remember why anyone commits suicide. It happens when someone loses hope. A terrorist who signs on for a suicide mission is someone who cannot imagine a better future. And so he wants to take it out on the people he thinks is responsible for his misery. His fury may be directed at a specific group. Gays in Orlando, white police officers in Dallas, a whole group of Westerners in Nice, relatives of the truck driver that ran through that promenade, just running over people, killing children, said that he could never control his anger. They said he would go into fits of rage and break everything around him. We must stand firm against evil. But we must also be vigilant not to become callous in the process. We must oppose violence, but we must not vilify people on the basis of their race or religion or ethnicity. We must stop terrorism, but we must not surrender to the idea that all Muslims are out to kill us. Wherever possible, we must channel our outrage into positive action. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are trying to lure us into declaring a war on Islam. We foil them when we build friendships with Muslims and have them as our allies. It seems to me that World War II provides us with a good example for our war on terrorism. We fought the Axis powers on the battlefield and sought to destroy their ideology. But once the combatants surrendered, we helped them rebuild their countries. We befriended their citizens. Now Germany, Italy, and Japan are our friends. They're our allies. Violence often begets violence. And the spiral of death can destroy everything that is decent and good and noble. How can we ensure that does not happen? Surely God wants us to figure out, in a world that is increasingly fragmented, how we can forge connections. In a world that is often harsh, how we can extend mercy. In a world that is becoming inhospitable, how we can exude loving kindness. And into situations that are demeaning, how we can inject dignity. We cannot allow anger to be our primary driving force. Righteous anger can motivate us to action, but it must always be guided by love and focused on a positive outcome. There's a cartoon that shows a man standing at the front of a long line. They're all standing right at the pearly gates. St. Peter is there, tall, long beard, looking very intimidating. And the man is wearing a t-shirt. And the t-shirt says, the church version is, "Stuff happens." Okay? And the man has his hand up and he's saying to St. Peter, "Please, can I go home and change my shirt?" What are the words that you live by? Are you focused on the higher things? Pope Francis has made quite an impact during his short tenure. He's talked about God's love for all people, and he's expressed compassion and humility to people in need. TV host Jon Stewart, who is Jewish, spoke for many people. When he raved about how much he liked the Pope, he says, "I just love this guy." It's embarrassing to see people get so excited and to talk about how refreshing it is to see someone who's acting like Christians are supposed to act. I wonder what would happen if all of us who claim to follow Jesus would take Paul's words to heart and focus on the higher things that are noble and valuable. And we all started just acting like Christians.